Everyone, this is Cole from the CX Matters podcast. I'm joined by a very special guest, Dominic. Dominic, please introduce yourself and your role.
Sure. Thank you very much, Cole. I'm Dominic Kayatta. I am the Senior Director for Patient Experience here at Bayhealth Medical Center, which is located in central and southern Delaware.
Welcome to the CX Matters podcast, a production of the American Journal of Healthcare Strategy, with your host, Cole Lyons.
We're so happy to have you on from the beautiful state of Delaware. I'm here in Philadelphia, so not too far off from you. We're really excited to discuss your career. You've had a long career in healthcare and especially in that CX, patient improvement space. I want to ask, what got you into this customer experience, patient experience space? What was that intro to that?
Yeah, so I think I've always had that bias, if you will, always trying to improve the experience regardless of who my customer was. And I've been very fortunate to do that in many industries and many fields, to include social services, mental health, as well as probably the most sustained has been in healthcare. But I also did it as an external consultant. And it was always my passion and purpose to provide superior experiences regardless who I was serving. This is 2 organizations ago. I was that internal resource for any of the departments trying to create education and developmental materials. And just around that time, that's when value-based purchasing hit. And now we had to think about how we provided the patient experience, how we measured that, and then ultimately got reimbursed for it. And that got a lot of people's attention. So the leader who was heading that up at the time reached out to me and said, hey, we got to do this education. We've got to look at this patient experience stuff differently. And so we started getting into it. I was just like, wow, somebody gets to do this for a living? This is awesome. How have I not known about this? And from there, that's what started my whole career. First starting out in patient advocacy, where I supervised teams that did patient relations and patient advocacy, managed grievances and complaints. And then from there was tapped to lead the patient experience initiatives at my last 2 organizations.
Very impressive. How long were you in your career before you made this shift? How many years had you been working post-college?
Yeah, I'm very old. That's the first disclaimer here. So it was a solid 20 years before I made the transition into that. But again, as discussed, I think customer experience was always top of mind. And I always like to start with the end in mind. So what's the impact I want to have on the end user? And now how do I shape all experiences, all services, and the organizational culture to be able to achieve that?
And because of that, did that make that shift a bit easier for you?
It really did, and it's always been my mantra. And now I bring it to the patient experience. How I start all my trainings and all my education is nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And once you start with that, then you can provide any service and form a real partnership. So that was my mantra, either working in mental health or working in the credit card industry or wherever. And it really served me well.
You've worked for some pretty impressive organizations in the region, ChristianaCare, Mainline, now Bayhealth, all kind of leading their patient experience department and mission. What did you do early on? Were there any projects? Were there any achievements early on in the patient experience career that made it so that people recognized you as someone who is really able to affect change?
Yeah. Going back to that experience at ChristianaCare, where it's first tapped, it was really helping all team members focus differently on the patient experience and how it was so connected to everything else we do from a quality, safety, equity standpoint, as well as reimbursement. And really what I say at the end of the day, it's getting credit for the hard work that everyone's doing and knowing that it is a real science. I think a lot of people just thought, just be nice to the patients, give them what they want, everything's going to be fine. But as we know now, and this has just exploded with your Press Ganey, your Barrow Institutes, so many other that have done the deep dive around the science of patient experience and how to create those and then measure it and what are the evidence-based practices behind that. So that's where I quickly had to become a student of the business and look for that research. And then once I had that data, that made the business case for me to then go out and say, this is where we need to focus. And as a result, I think a lot of people then saw the connection, the light bulbs went off for them, and they found that their jobs became easier. So less call bells, a lot of less disgruntled patients when you did this and you did it consistently.
That science aspect of it, right? Using kind of the scientific method, right, of testing,
Yep.
actually, forming hypotheses. That's really important in patient experience now. Like you're saying, it's exploded. But at the time, where did you learn that from? How did you figure that out? Because that's not something that, we pick up from college or high school.
Yeah, it really is. So it was just going out to the literature and just doing a lot of, looking at those key milestones in the patient journey. And then what were the connected approaches, strategies that would yield the greatest results. So it was just doing a lot of research and seeing what results early on. And it's just amazing because I was just referencing those as I'm creating some new materials here at my present work. And it's just amazing to say, oh my gosh, yeah, I remember doing that research back in 2008 to create this education, but it wasn't all in one place, where now you do have that all centrally located and makes a huge difference now that people have really compiled, put that together. But it was just a lot of disparate resources and then combing through. And then just as importantly, because it's one thing to have those best practices, but if they're not in line with the culture and the strategic vision of that organization, you're going to spin your wheels and hit your head against the wall a lot. So it was really important to incorporate what was important to that organization and their culture, what was in their mission and vision, value statement that I could include and research those because those were already familiar. So I just tried to leverage that in all of my research.
That's an important tactic, right? Because organizations recruit from all over the country. Our college background usually gives us a certain way of doing things.
Yes.
And when we come into a new organization, we might have to adapt and change that, right? So
Yeah.
do you have any recommendations on how we can do research and learn to adapt and change what we are presenting so that it matches the organization's goal and mission?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, for me, the best source of this data, it's one thing to do the research, but go to your patients. They're going to tell you at the end of the day when they think of your organization, what comes to mind. And it might be an experience in the emergency department or at a primary care office. They're going to remember how people made them feel. So I always start that as a foundational and then put all the building blocks on together. And for me too, it's more and more, we can't be in our silos anymore. So it's really adopting best practices from quality, safety. Now I would add equity into that, a unified approach. And in fact, just integrate it. So there's always, with every patient experience, we tend to just focus on the patient satisfaction side, but there's that great quadruple aim now, right? It's make me better, don't hurt me, and create a great experience. Obviously, we got to look at cutting the cost of providing health care. And then the last one is the well-being of our team members as well. So really making sure you baked in all 5 of those and how we can create efficiencies to drive down costs to make people want to come back and make the access easier for them.
No, that definitely answers the question. Focusing on that internal and external customer.
Yeah.
The patient experience is technically a non-clinical role. You're right. We don't have a degree that allows us to treat patients directly.
Yeah.
So one of the problems when it comes to really getting how our patients feel is we're not always working with patients on the front line. We're not always able to get that instantaneous feedback. It's a bit easier with the internal customer because we can do that, right? We can meet with our coworkers and be in those shared spaces. How throughout your career have you been able to get this patient feedback so that you get it in full context and clarity?
That's such a great question and so important. I think as leaders in this space, we have to be so intentional to carve out time that as I expect and demand all of my leaders to be rounding on patients, I have to round on them as well. And then managing the patient advocacy function too, I make sure I've got several cases on the books at all times. That keeps my finger on the pulse around that experience. Obviously, I read all of our comments from the week before, all of our Google reviews, other posts, just to really start to collect and create the picture of where those points of friction are. So that is kind of my system, my regiment, that I make sure I attend to that every single week, because if not, my credibility is shot if I can't walk in the shoes of our patient and, just as importantly, translate that experience to those that are at the bedside and providing care. So that's been really important. We also can't say enough about the power of patient and family advisory groups and making sure you have those, and you have those for the various service lines, because there's things that are very specific based on that service line and what's important to those patients and families. So I oversee all of those as well, and that's really kept my foot into understanding the voice of our customer.
So it is a science, but it's a field science, right? Where you're actually, you're not in a lab somewhere or in an office. You're actually really involved with these patients. And I have a question for you on what you mentioned about these advisory groups, right? It is really challenging sometimes to get members and patients to really want to be involved in these groups. What have you found to be especially successful?
It's those personal connections. So this is where using your grievance and complaint data and function to understand, those experiences, and then forming that relationship, because the goal again is to always reinstate that trust in our organization and have them come back for services. At the end of every phone call, at the end of every letter, it's that, and I never want to see this happen to any other patient or family member. So that's always my kind of inroad to say, hey, you said this, we talked through your situation. Do you really want to help patients moving forward? And if yes, have I got the opportunity for you? And a lot of times that's been very successful. And again, just not the relationships that I have. Obviously, that's something I preach, first of all, to my patient advocacy team, to say, hey, always be on the lookout for who you think would be a great ambassador.
So you don't avoid the claims and grievance people, you actually seek them out, which is a strategy. I've heard sometimes, let's avoid, bringing these people in because we don't want, to cause an incident, or, I've heard these things before in the industry. You kind of go after these people. How do you train your staff? Because you have a background in this training field, right? So how do you train your staff on how to deal with individuals who've had a really bad experience and who have a really valid claim, who might be very upset at what's happened to them?
Yeah. So first of all, it goes back to something that is a big part of my approach is mindful self-compassion. So I try to instill that on the front line, because going into these situations can be very, very contentious, as you can imagine, especially if there's been an error or a sentinel event. Having people lean into that and give them the skill sets from a service recovery perspective so they feel equipped, and when they don't, they know who their resources are. So a lot of times it's just that partnership, so really that's where I see my patient advocacy team and others. Hey, let's go in that room together and try to get the train back on the tracks, and then that follow-up several times during their stay, or if it's on an outpatient basis, let's just check in with them to see how their next appointment went. So now you start to form that relationship. So it's really understanding yourself. And if you're not in the frame of mind to go in and have that conversation, and I say you're allowed to tap out, let's get somebody else in there who has done a little bit of that breathing, that mindfulness, is not going to get what I like to say hooked by that negative energy, and just see the patient for who they are. It's never trying to explain away or make excuses. Really, people just want to be heard and seen and validated. So I say that's the biggest skill set you can do. And if you're still feeling stuck, call me, I'll come up to the room and we'll talk about it, all three of us, and really get to the underlying issue. Where was that anxiety coming from, or that real anger? And now, again, let's turn around this experience for that patient and family.
I really love that. And again, that focuses on the internal customer, right? All of us, because now the employee is going to have a much better experience. They're not going to go home, with stress or with huge amounts of anxiety over an incident, because they know that you're there to support them. So that's excellent advice. What can we do as maybe people who aren't directly in that CX space, but you still have customer interaction, if we want to start molding our careers to be a leader like yourself in CX and patient experience?
Where I always start is become a student of the business. If you can't know all the touch points of that patient journey, you're going to get stuck along the way and your effectiveness will quickly dwindle. So that's the first thing I did. The minute I was tapped to develop that education, I said, if I'm going to expect other people to do this, I got to understand it from start to finish. So I dug in. I did a lot of informational interviews. I put on the bunny suit and went in the OR. I met with our practices off site and just understood their challenges in providing healthcare, what a typical day was. So you have to get that credibility, first of all, especially if you are non-clinical, because people are looking at that, first of all, you better know what you're talking about here. You better understand what it takes for my team, my department, my service line to provide care, and what are our challenges. So I always start with that. Secondly, then I move to how can I get you credit for the hard work that you're doing? So again, by those observations, where they're stuck, what I read in the patient comments, I try to understand why they got into healthcare. And then as a result of COVID and many other things and challenges, capacity issues, access, people with a lot shorter fuses, workplace violence, what's important to the well-being of my team members. And when I come in with that approach, you just get a lot more traction. You get a lot more buy-in. And I think a lot of people, just stick to the research or just stick to the best practices and then get frustrated when they've got all these great ideas and you get no traction at the end of the day. So it's really understanding, as you put so well, both your internal and external customers. That's what's going to give you the greatest inroads and credibility.
On that note of credibility and gaining traction, because customer experience does not generate revenue directly, right? Even though it does have a massive impact on the revenue and cash flow. How have you in the past been able to tie those two things together so that financial leadership, thinking your CFO can sign off on some of these projects?
Yeah, it's really about doing what matters most, and what's going to get us the greatest gains, because I think a lot of people just try to boil the ocean, but that's not really going to get you where you want to be. So first of all, it's understanding what the end game are. What are the outcomes you're looking for? What are you measuring on your dashboard? And now what are the specific interventions that are going to get you there, instead of just trying to do everything? And a lot of times that resonates when you can make that business case to say, if we focus on these three things and create processes and systems around that, this is how it's going to raise our likelihood to recommend, or whatever it might be, or it really boost our reviews. And then people can say, okay, that makes a lot of sense. Let's talk about that. The other big business case for me too is looking at your quality and safety data and find out where the errors were. So again, I think people love to hear that, because now you've tied in keeping our patients safe as well as our employees on the patient side. But then on the employee side, sick days, workman's comp, so many of those other levers that a CFO is trying to look at on their balance sheet, that by creating those more high reliability systems, this is what's going to help us achieve our goals and save money at the same time.
Really solid advice. And thank you so much for coming on during our lunch hour today. I really do appreciate it. And I'm excited to listen to this back when it's done being edited and gain all the advice over, because I feel motivated now, and I'm hoping our audience will as well. Thank you so much for your time.
I've learned a lot too. So thank you.